OG says that this is an unfair system. We agree, but this is the necessary prerequisite in order for us to achieve any of the other benefits that are exclusive to the SEA Games so proud to propose. All right, firstly, on a little bit of framing. Like, realize that three parts of framing. Firstly, what is this debate about? Realize that this debate is purely about the SEA Games, and this is really important because there exist many other regional games in the status quo. Think about the Asian Games or think about the ASEAN Games. These are all other games that already exist. And so, what then is this? Why is it so important? Because realize that the SEA Games is unique because of the discretionary system. This is the only regional games that has this sort of system that allows host countries to actually be able to decide. So, insofar as like this is the one, like this is just one competition, I think they need to prove why exactly like fairness in this one competition is so important, especially when there is other alternatives that exist. Second, realize that this is a rotational system, right? So obviously, while it may be like unfair in like this one cycle, that like the Asian Games takes the SEA Games take place literally once every 2 years, and obviously there'll be a rotation of hosts afterwards. So like if one country really does benefit disproportionately from it, I think it's probably going to be counterbalanced out by the subsequent hosting of games by other countries. But I think thirdly, we know that to mitigate the worst excesses of harms, there already exists appeals in the status quo. It's literally in emphasized. So obviously this is not perfect, but realize that this mitigates the worst harms in which like this is really a sport that fucking no one does and that has zero popularity. Hence, we can at least like argue or like it's incredibly likely that at the very least you're still going to get some level of popularity of these games. It just may not be the most common. All right then, two points of the house today. Firstly, about how this allows niche sports to be represented, and then secondly, how this results in a better quality of games in general. All right, firstly, it allows for niche sports to be represented. Realize what exactly is the counterfactual on their side. I think obviously, as they argue, it's going to be decided by the SEA Games or committee and whatever not. So what's it likely to look like? Obviously, it's likely going to look like things like a more like a set like availability of sports or like a set rotation of sports or like the council deciding as they concede. And as they mentioned, they're likely going to be focused on mainly predominantly common sports. I think for all the reasons that they already mentioned, insofar as like these are the ones that are the most known and these are the ones that have the most pre-existing investment. But I think more importantly, like realize that this is on the best case. In the worst case, because we need to recognize that not everyone has the ability to uniform or like equally participate inside the council. We think that it's incredibly likely that these councils are going to be dominated uniquely by the richer nations for two simple reasons. For the first reason, that these are the ones with more political capital, like obviously your political heavyweights like Indonesia and Singapore. But I think secondly, these are also countries with the most sporting legacy. So like you see Indonesia in like the Olympics finals at the very like far more frequently than you do like I don't know Myanmar. So at the very least, I think these are the point in which like Indonesia is going to be perceived to have more legitimacy and they are going to be the ones who have a lot more domination in council and they are also the ones who are more willing to invest in this council in the very first place. And so this just means that it becomes like this just means that it's not about that you're going to get equal representation. It's more likely that you're going to get like incredibly like you're still gonna have domination, but the domination uniquely done by richer nations. At the end of the day, there's going to be this level of rigidity that makes it incredibly hard for you to introduce new sports. And why is this already bad? Because realize that these common sports are already being represented in a lot of other nations or like a lot of other regional games. When the opportunity cost is that you neglect these other niche games. What do these look like? Tend to look like more cultural games, but realize that these cultural games are already dying out. These cultural sports are already dying out, and there needs to be more representation for these places, for these sports, insofar as they have no, insofar as like this is something that, in terms of like the skill vulnerability, deserve to be represented more. But I think secondly, there also is a lack of alternatives for these other sports. So realize it's incredibly important for this to be the one unique platform in which they're represented. But thirdly, realize that obviously national pride exists. People from disadvantaged countries, life kind of sucks for them. And obviously that means that the ability for the country to get medals, the ability for them to actually see their cultural sports on the stage is incredibly important for these people. This allows for them to achieve a sense of belonging in a place that where like in regions where they otherwise would not be able to access this. Insofar as poor countries oftentimes genuinely really, really need this, insofar as like it's generally really hard for them to otherwise get a sense of belonging. This is an incredibly important source of happiness for people to be able to access. But then are the impacts of this? I think firstly, again, more discretion, it just means that you have more niche games. We're willing to trade off the idea of more common games, and because we think it's more important for these niche games to get this sort of representation, insofar as like, and this is important for both the culture of the country and being able to preserve it. But secondly, also for the athletes of this country, these people have worked tirelessly for a niche game. They sacrifice infinitely more than people from who are training in a common sport. We think they deserve more representation. But I think secondly, we need to recognize that the SEA Games need to position themselves in a like amongst all of the other regional games. Insofar as they are the ones who are known for showing the unique games, they are the ones that actually allow for these places to for these countries to have this space for representation. This allows for the SEA Games to distinguish themselves amongst other games and allows for them to procure a unique identity. Before I go on, is there anything for closing?
It is empirically true that most host countries run a deficit when they host things like the Olympics or the SEA Games. The problem here is for cultural preservation of those sports to exist, you have to prove why the viewership of those cultural sports is going to offset the costs meant to prop them up, etc.
Yeah, but these are all like calculations that countries can make for themselves. And in fact, I'm going to be talking about why we get countries more willing to bid on our side. Okay, so more importantly, secondly, about how we get better games. I think realize that there are several benefits to discretionary posting uniquely. The first one is that obviously, like I think as OG pretty much says, like you get an advantage when you host. We completely concede that, we completely acknowledge that countries are self-interested and countries are just going to want to pursue this more. But I think secondly, realize that they like obviously they're able to take into account practical considerations, yada yada. So then realize that this results in there being firstly unique incentives to bid and host, but secondly, more willingness to spend money on that bid. So why is this so important? Or like why is this the case? Because firstly, in like these countries know that it provides more advantages. But secondly, when you know that a host country gets like incentive, for example, Malaysia sees Thailand exclude karate. In the next hosting cycle, they have far more incentive to actually bid with karate. And so this just means that you have more bids and you're actually able to have competitions amongst bids to important for you to actually get better sports. What then is the impact of this? I think firstly, this just means that countries are willing to actually bid for the games. Because as we mentioned, hosting is expensive. Now, at the very least, like we are able to get the games in general because people like countries see that the benefits outweigh the harm. But I think secondly, this also leads to more like poor countries being able to bid. So obviously now there's no incentive, but now that you can realistically win, you can realistically get recognition, you can get that cultural benefit and whatever not. Like that's the point at which the national identity, and this is the tipping point for them to start bidding. Because they know that they actually want like are able to get these benefits, which makes it so that they are actually willing to take that trade-off. Realize that this is all the prerequisite to any sort of benefit, insofar as this allows us to even get games in general. So what then is the counterfactual? Realize that firstly, no one but the rich countries are able to bid, which is far more exclusionary. But I think secondly, this is likely going to remove an existing system, and people are likely going to be incredibly angry. They're going to be incredibly likely to boycott, which is far worse for the games. Insofar as this scale blows OG out of the water, so proud, oh.
I think the leader of opposition for their speech. Now I invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, just to confirm, I am visible and audible?
Yep.
Best. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Why are the South Asian Games important? Two reasons. Number one, a lot of the South Asian countries have Olympic pipelines, and I'm already sort of characterized this. The more competitions exist, the more countries are better off in terms of training their sports people to perform well at forums like the Olympics. In general, the reason why you don't want a lot of friction in the South Asian Games is because the fact that you generally compromise this pipeline, this overall makes athletes all over South Asia a lot worse. Insofar as the South Asian Games is one of the many, many forums that exist, but these forums are all necessary for athletes to have as many opportunities as possible. Their survival is of paramount importance, therefore you can't compromise on this viewership. But secondly, if hostility isn't tackled in the South Asian Games, there's no way that it doesn't translate over into other hosting events as well. So insofar as your counterfactual is that other sporting events exist, if there is friction and if there is sporting rivalries that sort of come over here on this forum, we are not sure why that wouldn't translate over to other sports as well. Second rebuttal. Countries will benefit in alteration, and that's why they're going to be completely fine. I think the info slide disagrees with you. Malaysia launching a bid trying to fight against that discretion shows that the fact that Malaysia is probably going to bid again in the future and therefore going to be benefiting from the same system is not sufficient to prevent the friction that exists in the status quo. That means that countries are looking at the opportunity that they can get in any one given cycle, insofar as they feel that they're being disadvantaged and their sporting needs are not being sort of like met. We think that friction is going to exist. Third piece of rebuttal. Is the counterfactual, which is on proposition side, going to be dominated by host nations? Two rebuttals to this. Number one, if this is true, and this is an even if argument, wouldn't domination happen through the discretion system anyway? Because as so insofar as like larger countries could just host appeals to the South Asian Games, if they were really that dominated by host countries, couldn't the appeals themselves also be rejected or processed by these larger countries, and they could use their influence to reject those appeals in the first place? Number one, but that doesn't happen. Why? Because it's not just about being a historically powerful or a foundational country. It's about whether or not there are power imbalances or economic imbalances between all the countries that are participating in any particular forum. Insofar as most South Asian countries tend to be on the reasonably similar level of like parity. Obviously, you have like exceptions like on the far ends of the spectrum insofar as like economic disparity is concerned. But in general, most of the participants within South Asian games have relatively similar economies in terms of like what their economic contribution to the South Asian games is. We don't think that this influence that they're trying to sort of like paint off like historic nations exists in the same way that they sort of like have. We don't think that this power sort of exists. But notice that this analysis doesn't engage with the argument that Anam gave, which is that on the comparative, even if that is so, and even if there's some level of influence that larger countries have, it's easier to hold accountable when you can't hide behind discretion to sort of like to sort of like support the ideals of your own sporting growth. You have the ability to call out the South Asian Forum. You have the ability to compare with all the various ways that they've hosted past events, and all the countries unanimously can hold the forum sort of like accountable. It is in all of their united best interest to do so. We think more accountability on our side, even if these events are dominated. Number four, niche games exist. A few questions insofar as the protection of niche games existing. Number one, insofar as we've sort of proven to you that you're likely to get more buy-in because of the fact that you're hosting like more popular games, which means that you're going to be hosting a lot more economically viable games, because like here's how popular games work, right? These are games that are, number one, bought into by the vast amount of of the South Asian community, which means that these are games that the vast amount of countries have athletes that they're willing to participate in. What happens when you have greater athletic participation from the greatest amount of countries? Number one, you have access to the most amount of markets possible, which means that your sporting events are being watched by the most markets. Number two, insofar as these games are popular, the level of viewership that you're likely going to get is going to be much, much higher in that sort of like on that sort of front as well. And number three, insofar as participation is greater, the level of athletic competition is higher, which means that the amount of legitimacy attached to each medal is going to be much higher as well, because these are generally going to be seen as far more competitive events. What happens when you prioritize popularity first? Notice that you have 22 minimum sports, but there's no maximum, which means that once you have the amount of money necessary to make sure that you are out of the viewership crisis that currently plagues the vast amount of games that are happening at an international level. The fucking Olympics at this point in time has a viewership crisis that sort of like means that countries are less and less willing to bid for the Olympics. The more economically sustainable you make these games by taking out the discretion that countries have in terms of like how you globally popular sports, the more money you get. And what do you do with that money? You platform small sports. Anam already talked about this, by the way. And what that sort of like looks like is that niche games are much more likelier to sort of like show up in our model, but they're likelier to show up in a more sustainable way. But even if that's not the case, why can't niche games be sort of hosted on a national level, insofar as the benefit of niche games is that people from the will have like a lot of cultural appreciation attached to these sports? Then wouldn't the like main appreciators of the niche sport be the people from that country themselves? So wouldn't you then just benefit like from just hosting that on a national and regional level? Why is the burden of the South Asian Games to host these niche events? I have no idea, because I would say that the burden of the South Asian Games in this point in time, or their primary interest, is to sort of like maintain a level of athletic cooperation and athletic performance across all the sort of like South Asia, to make sure that athletes and participants from South Asia are far more likely to perform better at international events and strengthen the South Asian like regional scene, also reduce as much friction as possible. Before I move on, very, very quickly, closing, if you have a POI.
Okay,
Opening?
so
Sorry, no.
all right. If more nations involved leads to a bigger economic market, why did Thailand limit it?
Because of all the reasons that Anam talked about, which is to say that discretion is used for a lot of reasons. Number one, countries are likely to use discretion to restrict sports because the fact that they have sports that they perform well in, which they want to host on their sort of like markets, because that gives them the most benefits in terms of sports washing, getting the most success on a national level, making their people feel as if their own athletes are doing well. Number two, they have incentives as far as making sure that their Olympic pipeline is running well, and therefore they're producing athletes that are going to do well at the Olympics, regardless of whether other countries are benefiting from that as well. And in general, the third harm, obviously, that we've talked about is that discretion is likely to lead to friction and in appeals between countries. Insofar as countries feel that there is no perception of like fairness, or that a host is not really catering to their strengths or not facilitating their sporting aims, they're likely to use the appeal system to try to harass smaller countries. They're likely to do things like boycott the Olympics, boycott the South Asian Games. This also like escalates to a lot of rivalries and boycotts that are happening on this level as well. If you want an example of this, look at, for example, how the ICC generally creates friction between Pakistan and India, where, keeping in mind that, for example, like India has its own sporting interests that would involve a lot of like suppression of Pakistani cricket. The way that they sort of like the way that the tensions sort of like work in that is that Pakistan Pakistan ends up opposing all the all the events that are happening in India, and sort of like vice versa. We think that we end up achieving on our model is number one, a more sustainable version of the South Asian Games, a more accessible version of the South Asian Games, ones that produces better athletes, ones that has more aspects of like niche games existing, and one that generally has less friction and more accountability. For all of these reasons, opening government.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. Now I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Sorry.
Okay. Hi, my name is Justin. He, him, QS in the chat, please. I want to first talk about the willingness to even bid for these events to begin with. There are three reasons as to why it actually explains that these are really difficult under propositions paradigm. Firstly, as they admit, it is expensive to hold these games. Secondly, other games exist within the region, particularly ASEAN Games or even the Olympics. But lastly, this is an event that happens every 2 years, so you need quite a lot of hosts going into perpetuity. This explains usefully why, without giving the host country certain perks or implicit advantages, they wouldn't have an incentive to do two things. Firstly, they wouldn't have an incentive to bid at all, or to the extent that they bid, they don't present strong bids, they only present weak bids. They don't fund it as greatly because there's a less chance for them to win medals when they host it necessarily. But secondly, often they're going to boycott the SEA Games on their side of the house because that prior expectation that they are going to receive some advantage, not only like financially, but also from a medal national glory perspective when they host. If you remove that prior expectation, that also removes the willingness of countries to either bid for the games or participate in at all, because on their side of the house, actually explained that the comparative was that within this council, the richest and most powerful nations were the ones that are going to be the most influential in deciding what exactly were the types of sports that are going to be represented. At this point in the round, you should believe that when we give them the incentive to invest, when they believe that they can win more medals in their sports, was the tipping point to increasing the amount of funding by host countries that makes the games accessible for the most number of sports that will be represented on either side of the house within the SEA Games. And the point here is that I think most countries would be okay with tolerating other hosts using their implicit advantage in this way. The reason why was simple. It was because your turn would come eventually. It would come in the next cycle. So you'll be okay with Thailand doing this because you as Malaysia know that the next time you host the SEA Games, you can pull the same stunt. The comparative is that on their side of the house, all games are decided for you by the council. There's never a single game where you have that comparative advantage. So on the balance of probabilities, we at least have one game or a few games where we have comparative advantages. On their side, there are no games where that country gets an advantage. So this responds nicely to their ideas about frictions, because you will benefit eventually. That explains why these frictions don't actually matter. But notice, with the quibble about appeals, in both scenarios, it doesn't work. If the appeals actually do work, that actually explains why we have accountability mechanisms outside the house, such that this policy of discretion won't be done in the worst instances, right? Because it's far easier to hold one country accountable versus an amorphous SEA Games council where the largest players are going to have a large hand in deciding the lineup. But if the appeals don't work, that also explains why our willingness point to host the country or to bid for the SEA Games actually works in that sort of situation. Therefore, the perception of unfairness isn't that bad for our case. Firstly, because we actually include less represented sports. So in that sense, it's really hard to include minority sports as unfair necessarily. But more importantly, I think viewership doesn't really care about this amorphous concept of sporting integrity or this vague feeling of unfairness. What they care a lot more about was having better held games, was it having more funded, that more importantly translated into a better viewership experiences and real representation for minority sports. All of this was important because the heart of our case was that minority sports were more able to be represented under our paradigm. On their side of the house, in their council, the most popular sports by their admission, the sports where the big, strong countries like Indonesia and Singapore, the sports they have a comparative advantage in, like in badminton, for instance, those are the sports that are going to be overrepresented in SEA Games. And it's not just about the lineup, it's about the number of medals that each sport receives. And that is something that the big council would have a large amount of pull and influence over. The comparative on outside of the house is that the host country wants more niche sports in because that is something that allows them to distinguish their events and would allow them to have a competitive edge in that SEA Games. And this is all incredibly important because even if you're talking about the Olympic pipelines that is the SEA Games, I just don't think they are that important. Firstly, because the ASEAN Games also exist for a pipeline. Secondly, in most instances, a lot of the popular sports would still remain, so it's unclear how big the harm is. But thirdly, if it is even recognized internationally, right? Like karate. The point then is that a lot of the athletes in these sports in particular will always find avenues to get funded and represented, but the sports from minority backgrounds can't get funded on purely a national level without the seeming interest from having a regional SEA Games where athletes from multiple different countries are all participating, trying to get national glory. That is the world where you get a lot more funding for underrepresented sports, which are far more important in terms of bringing glory to certain disenfranchised communities that require the representation and preservation of their key cultures. And it's not just about allowing them to play. It was always about recognizing the influence and merits that the individuals who participate in it, i.e. the athletes, we needed to recognize their efforts internationally. And that is something exclusive to outside the house, where host countries had active incentives to get these niche sports through the door. The only thing they have in response to this is to say, well, these are unpopular sports. But that honestly misses the point, because no one tunes into the Olympics or the SEA Games going, I want to watch volleyball, I want to watch football. No, you just turn on your TV screen and you watch whatever is playing at that point in time, because no one actively follows any of the sports in question necessarily. But the point at which people watch symmetrically, but now in our SEA Games, every time there's a new rotation, there's a new sport that actually creates a large amount of intrigue. So I can at the very least flip the point about popularity, because including new niche sports actually excites viewership with regards to what they'll see next on their TV screen. But even if that doesn't actually happen, the point is that people do watch the SEA Games symmetrically, and the point isn't that they were previously unpopular. The point is that they now become popular because you see really exciting gameplay on your TV screens. When you turn on the TV, you watch Sepak Takraw for the first time and you go, wow, this is a real genuine sport. That's what increases viewership on both sides of the house. Yeah, sure. CG.
People do not watch the SEA Games symmetrically. They watch it because they think their country has a chance at winning. They watch it because they played the same sport in the backyard with their friends, and they therefore think they themselves can see or learn things that they watch on TV when they're watching the sport.
Okay, I mean, fair enough, but there's a few points of mitigation, right? The first is that, like, it's not just all minority sports on our side. Like, usually the most popular sports are broadly going to be represented on both sides. I'm willing to undercut my impact somewhat. But the point then is that for the few minority sports that we get through the door, people were already watching volleyball. In the next segment is Sepak Takraw, so we would stay on for that segment on our side of the house. The point then is that there's actually a lot more outrage on their side of the house, because your sports never get chosen, they never get represented. On our side, you can decide for yourself with our mechanisms to put these minority sports through the door. At any point in time, even if there was a mild fall in viewership, it doesn't really matter, because the host countries were willing to contribute a lot more money into hosting the games, because they understood that they needed to represent their cultures and their minority sportsmen in a very delicate light. That level of recognition, therefore, outweighed any of the speculative harms about falls in viewership. I don't think that is certain, but if it is indeed somewhat certain, you should weigh more significantly the representation and recognition that falls onto minority sportsmen on our side of the house. Oppose.
I think that yellow for their speech. Now I invite the member of government. Here.
All right. So 3 contributions from closing government. First, we're going to explain why we get more long-term development and investment into sports. Secondly, why the appeals process will fail. And third, engaging on OO about niche sports. So first thing I want to talk about is why there's better long-term development and investment into sports. Because OO's claim in response to this is that sports overall in the region is harmed because there are no incentives to bid for these games. We have 3 points to note here. One, as they themselves could see, it's a rotational basis. So even if you have comparatively less autonomy in deciding when the games can be held or what types of sports to include on the roster, the fact is that there's still 10 years between each games that Malaysia hosts, 10 years between each games that Cambodia hosts, which still gives you some flexibility in doing this because it is on a rotational basis for which countries are able to host it. Number 2, there are strong socio-economic benefits to hosting the games. People staying at hotels, athletes eating at restaurants, all boost the economy in some way. Third, there are strong reputational incentives for hosting these games because it shows that you are in fact a leader in sports, even if not for winning the medals themselves, but the fact they were able to have all of this infrastructure. Because if there's a new SEA Games, able to build a new swimming pool, a new stadium, that is what also increases like the general development of sports aside from the SEA Games moving into the future. So this explains why even if you remove this one thing, it's not going to just kill off the SEA Games completely. There's no mechanism from OO and how they think people are just suddenly going to boycott the SEA Games, because as we all agree on both sides of the house, the SEA Games are an important avenue for these countries to gain recognition and strength. What we will in fact argue here is that the long-term development and investment into certain sports overall only happens when we have assurance that an international body is able to regulate what types of sports go into there with less discretion given to individual host countries. The first impact here is that we get rid of significant inequality in participation. So many of these games are included and excluded on the official schedule on very short notice. Take note of the example in the info slide about the 2025 SEA Games, but the schedule only came out in 2024. Malaysia's appeal is only in 2024. Which means there's a very limited timeline for countries to prepare their athletes for the participation and winning in these games. And the reason this is bad is because countries with the most ability to decide when they're able to shift their resources around are probably countries that are comparatively wealthier. So countries like Singapore, where more money being put into sports and infrastructure over other countries in Southeast Asia, means they have a greater capacity to have an advantage in the games. The reason why this is bad is clearly it takes away from the whole fair spirit of sports. But I think the second thing is that it just entrenches certain countries' position within the SEA Games even more. So even if it's technically still competition, the reason it is bad is because you get less of the excitement of sports overall, because countries get less of time to plan for which of the games are going to be there in the future. So for example, if they know that karate isn't included this time round, the ability for you to invest into the sports that are actually included there is only afforded to the most privileged countries. This beats OG, because OG is uncharitable because they claim there's no inequality between the SEA Games Council because they make equal economic contributions. This may be true, but I think we take OO at their best, where even if we assume that there's some countries are wealthier than others, the reason why this is bad is because the countries with the most ability to respond and flexibly adjust their sports budgets are those with more money, rather than those countries who are likely to see sports as less of an important investment for them, which means in these countries, you get less and less sports over time. Second, we just multiply all the positive impacts of sports. So even if OO is right, that they get maybe just about the same level of sports involvement overall, what we explain is that more investment and planning leads to this better quality, because the long-term and development into sports is more assured, more likely to have voters being like okay with doing this. It's more politically palatable when you say that, okay, we're going to fund lots of money into basketball programs because we have assurance that the next host is not simply going to just take away basketball from the official games, because we know that basketball is something that is universally celebrated across the Southeast Asian countries. So this means they have better ability to justify putting money into sports, especially when many of these countries don't have the ability right now because there's so much uncertainty of whether in the next season these sports will be there or not. Thirdly, the games will be viewed as fairer. And I think the problem with OO is they unironically think people are just okay with unfairness because it's nebulous and because you will have your turn one day. What happens if you don't have your turn? Clearly, it's countries with the greater economic capacity that can host these countries, because as they say, these countries make losses when they host these games, which means the ability for you to just be okay with unfairness because you may one day host the games is still completely asserted from their side. This also beats OG, because OG's pathway to victory is just saying they get more palatable and more popular games. But as CO says, if those games are so palatable and popular, won't they be included anyways? So what we are explaining here is that the quality of the games increases overall. We get more planning and investment into those things, and that's better in the future. The second is about why the appeals process cannot work. So OO is right in pointing out that appeals exist. This response works against OG but not CG. Why will the appeals process fail? Number one, there's an extremely short timeline. Again, 2025 is the SEA Games. The appeal only works in 2024. There's very limited time to submit your argument, to have enough evidence to suggest that this is something that should be overturned, and the ability for the Federation Council to act on this appeal is also very limited and a time squeeze. Number two, it's very easy to reject the appeals. Thailand can just claim, oh, we don't have the infrastructure to do it, so they can just reject Malaysia's appeal from the outright, even if there are very fair and legitimate reasons for Malaysia to submit the appeal. The comparative is these countries are better suited to making these decisions overall when they're in the body, because you have voting processes, you have consensus processes, they're able to include past economic data from all events that only the body has access to. So these countries are going to make comparatively poorer decisions, even if you're not biased, as OG says quite uncharitably, is that these countries have more short-sightedness, less ability to consider these things. Before that, OO.
So when you submit your proposal, you can just include the list of sports that will be held, and we can use capital to make this reform happen if that's not true in status quo.
Yeah, but the problem is that, again, many of these countries end up choosing the sports to be on that schedule quite poorly. And it's also the case that the SEA Games Federation Council announces who is the host like 8 years in advance, which means it's very difficult for you to have already hosted already confirmed your schedule and the types of sports you want to include on the bid at the time of approving the bid, which is why it comes out very late and the appeals process doesn't work. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about niche sports. So all themselves concede that the SEA Games are not the only sports event. We still have national based events here. So they don't explain why the SEA Games are the most important thing to include these niche sports. But even if we assume the SEA Games, including niche sports, are important, the first is that they'll be viewed as tokenistic events under their side. This is like sepak takraw is only here because Malaysia is hosting. It's only here because Indonesia is hosting, rather than being a legitimate sport that everyone can participate in, which means that that value of the sport goes down even if you have the sport there. Number two, as we point out in the POI, hosting the SEA Games is very expensive. Host countries make millions in losses sometimes. So this comes at the expense of other games, but it also means that you have less and less buy-in into these sports because they are seen as loss makers. Whereas as opposed to our side, we have long-term investment into sports overall. It's far better for the development of sports. For these reasons, propose.
I think the member of COF, just please keep me like 1 minute. I'll just come back. All right, sorry, I'm back. Member of opposition, here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I believe I'm visible right now. Thank you, Chair. So from closing opposition, we're going to give you a very simple extension. That is to say that we're going to analyze the economic viability of certain of hosting certain events. And secondly, I'm going to talk about how the politics within the within this Southeast Asian Games Committee is going to function. We think it was a big problem that none of the other three teams really wanted to dig into this area. Because what we say is that there has been a lack of explanation in how it is that people within the community, nations representatives within the committee, is going to decide what sports are popular or what sports are necessary or more fundamental. We think that this process is highly likely to be politicized, meaning that it is very important. It is important to recognize that all the arguments about how you can now install fairness and less frictions and conflicts within this community in South Asia, these kind of arguments just fall out of this debate, because it is never really going to be fair in the first place. What we say on top of that is that when you have a politicized process where we assume that each nation's representative take a vote in deciding what sports needs to be included, we think it is going to lead to a less economically viable game series, which means that there is going to be a burden on host nations, and therefore it's going to be a burden on the athletes. We think that athletes have invested their time and effort a lot, and we think that their welfare, their passion, their willingness to be representing the nation is something that is very uniquely important in this debate, and that is the impact that we are going to go for on closing opposition. So, firstly, about the politics within these, about the economy of hosting Southeast Asian Games. Now, we think right now, when Thailand limits a number of sports, we think that they have made a careful due diligence and a study on how much they're going to invest and the right amount of return. We all know that the more sports they host, it's likely to lead to a bigger market. But the thing is, they haven't. Government side has failed to take into account that there's a huge investment, meaning that it is up to each nation who know the best about their economy and the cost of building stadiums and residencies for the athletes and those countries to make the best economically viable decision, and to then select what sports they're going to host. Second reason why we think that the current system, where there is a host nations are allowed to decide what games they host, is likely to be cheaper in investment, is because we think that they are likely to invest in culturally popular local sports, meaning that there probably is already a reasonably big infrastructure set up on a daily daily hosting of games in that nation, meaning that you don't have to invest a lot more into that game. So therefore, we think that there is going to be an economically viable hosting system right now in the status quo. What happens on their side, perhaps? This is where the economy comes, the politics come in. Now, when you have, for example, people voting on the basis of what sports are more popular, because there's no universal way of deciding what sports are more popular or whatever, people have different ways of viewing what is more popular or what is more fundamental, or, for example, what is more important to be included. Now, when you have that, you probably have voting within that system. It was a problem that for model governments not to specify how that is going to be made. But the thing is, when we have this, people are going to probably, first of all, try to persuade other people that it is the purpose of the Southeast Asian cooperation to be more inclusive, and therefore they're going to propose for a lot more things to be, more sports to be hosted. Secondly, within the voting system, we think that powerful nations are likely to win. I think this came a little bit from the opening opposition. But what we would say is that, for example, Singapore, when they probably see an opportunity of having a very fine high-class athletes who is good at certain sports, they're probably not going to say that this is a minor sport, but therefore it should be excluded. Now, they're probably going to say that this should be included, and they're going to use their political and economic power to try to influence other nations. Thirdly, we say that there's going to be a lot of under-the-table negotiations between the nations. So what's really going to happen is that Thailand is probably going to ask Malaysia to say that, oh, we are going to include your national sports. Therefore, please vote for including Muay Thai as a sport that needs to be hosted within nations. We think the implication of this is that there's going to be a lot more sports that need to be hosted to be done in a certain SEA Games series, and therefore we think that there's going to be more investment needed. Now, they don't think that there's going to be more good negotiation and really accountable kind of careful decision on what sports need to be taken needs to be hosted. Well, we think that falls because of the precise reason that they themselves have mentioned in this debate. They told us that sport is linked to national pride. It is often abused by populist politicians, and therefore they would vote they would make very populist, silly decisions. They're probably going to do that in the committee political decision-making process as well, and therefore we think that they're going to have a lot more sports to be hosted, and that is a problem. Now, why do we think this is bad? So we don't say, like the opening opposition, that there's not going to be no games hosted. I think that realistically we can actually expect certain levels of that we can expect that certain nations are probably going to host this kind of this sporting events. But the thing is, they would have to invest a lot in order. I'll take you in a second. Invest a lot in making stadiums, residencies, hygiene, and all that kind of things. Yes.
On either side of the house, it's ridiculously expensive to host sporting events. Rio from 2016 is still recuperating the cost of hosting the Olympics in 2016. What this means is that regardless on either side of the house, it's still stronger countries that are able to bid for these things in the first place. Quite uncomparable.
No, the thing is, when you have exactly my point. Olympics is decided on the basis of people, or the committee deciding on a vote basis, and that led to Rio being hosting a lot of sports beyond their capacity. So they're probably going to have hygiene problems, like in Rio de Janeiro, in Paris. A lot of people who swam in the river have severe health problems because the Parisian government didn't really have the capacity to invest in clean water and that kind of stuff. We think that security is also going to be an issue for these people. So what happens is that the athletes come into a certain nation expecting that they can participate and contribute well, but they can't really do that because the infrastructure is not necessarily ready for them to participate in the fullest to achieve their fullest potential. We also say that this is going to lead to a lot of athletes not participating in this event in the first place. What happened is in Rio de Janeiro is that because they expected the infrastructure to be very poor, people withdrew from coming in. We think this is a loss in terms of all the benefit of sports that all the other three teams have came up with, and therefore we think this motion has to fall. Thank you.
Thank the member of opposition for their speech. Now I invite the government whip. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Now, I'm going to first take out closing opposition. I'm then going to explain why our side of the house were able to prove why you get significantly more long-term investments into sports across all of Southeast Asia. And I'm going to weigh this against the two metrics from our opening team. Firstly, on fairness, and second, on culture. But first, I posit that closing opposition cannot win this debate. What they say is, the process of bidding is likely to be quite bad, and therefore passport nations will always win. One, I'd like to observe, as I said in the POI, that this is uncomparative because of the fact that Rio de Janeiro is still recuperating the losses from the Olympics when they literally took a 300% deficit in 2016 and are still unable to get rid of the cost of what happened when millions of people were influxing into their countries. The fact that sanitation problems happen because many people are there. The solution to closing opposition worsens this, because at least on our side of the house, if only the big countries are necessarily hosting or bidding for this, this means they're self-selecting into this because they think even if it were the case that all the sports are quite common, they do have the capacity to host this. All closing opposition says is, now they are very excited to host because of the fact that they have the cultural event here. But here's the problem. Many of these countries now, therefore, are overestimating the weight of their own cultural sports because they are still very niche to the rest of the world, and because in their nationalistic pushes for people to push for them to overbid. The problem here, therefore, is that you imagine Laos, all of Southeast Asia going to Laos despite them not having the capacity to host this. So closing opposition says there are sanitation problems. The sanitation problems just get fucking worse on their side of the house. Okay, I'm now going to explain how we get significantly better viewership and long-term investment into specific sports. Because here's what closing of government tells you on this clash. All they say is, guys, you get more legitimacy because more people are watching this. This is a deadlock with what opening opposition says. Because what opening opposition says is, guys, obviously we're still going to have some extent of sports that are quite common across every year. But this is not the mechanism that we told you. What we told you is that one, teams and countries want certainty before they invest into a specific sport. The reason for this is couplefold. One, that sports are significantly high investment things to invest in because of the fact that it takes long amounts of time to build stadiums. You need to carve out the land to do this and get independent contractors who do these sorts of things. But two, because of the fact that time is necessary to do things like cultivate athletes such that they are able to compete at the world stage, because taking one elementary school kid to play badminton from a tiny age to get them to cultivate to a 20-year-old adult that's able to compete in the Southeast Asian Games is incredibly long processes that many countries do not want to take the risk of if they are not certain that they're able to get investments out of this in the first place. For all of these reasons, these are two mechanisms that are very important, because this is what opening government misses. All opening government says is, guys, they assert there will be more legitimacy, and that's it. But here's the problem, right? At the point in which, one, I posit that both closing opposition and opening opposition already concede the premise that countries can agree on select numbers of sports to fixate on our side of the house. That's also the point to which the way countries react is that they funnel money into these sports knowing they will exist on the Southeast Asian Games for years and years, and they cannot do that under open government's premise, because they do not prove why the time and the certainty of knowing these sports will exist year in and year on is a prerequisite to them ever investing within those areas in the first place. And this is very important, right? Because the fact that on our side of the house, now you just get significantly more higher level sports. The counterfactual is that they never plan for those games because they never think it's worth putting much money into these games if there's the possibility that it could just get erased and athletes have to wait for another 2 years, and those countries have to bite the overhead costs of like not being able to see any result despite putting this much money and subsidies into those specific areas, especially when politicians are incredibly short-termist within the status quo already. The impact of this as follows. One, you just get significantly higher level sports because more people are able to invest within those sports knowing that they will exist year in and year on. And this is important, right? The only point in which Southeast Asian sports break through is when you're able to watch Malaysians contest the gold medal in badminton. It's when you're able to watch Singapore race in swimming for the Olympic gold. And that those sorts of sports or sports personalities around those specific areas only happens at the point in which you're able to have more of these people coming together to compete within these sorts of sports. Before I move on, sure, opening opposition.
But major sports are broadly recognized, so karate will still get funding even if they're not on 1C games. But what about the niche sports, right? They only get funding on our side if the council doesn't pick it.
Yeah, okay, don't get scammed by this. This is mitigation, right? Because at the very least, on their side of the house, they have to trade off 50% of the popular sports for the niche spots if op bets want any sort of impact. So we just get 50% of more sports with more revenue, because even if you get karate on either side of the house, maybe tennis gets cut, and that's a lot of money that could bring in from this, because 1 or 2 star athletes breaking into the scene, such as Coco Gauff in the United States, brings millions of dollars into those specific economies, which they lose out on their side of the house. And here's the point, right? You only get viewership when it is common sports that you play. It is sports that you feel your country is represented versus watching it be shit. And this is the POI that I asked the opening opposition that they never responded to. So given the bottom line now on our side of the house is 1, you get more viewership, but 2, I'd go further. You get more viewership around Southeast Asian solidarity, because the fact that you see Singapore, and even if you're from Malaysia, you can still resonate with those people's experiences. And this is important. Even if opposition bench proves that you get cultural niches for 1 or 2 countries, on our side of the house, we weigh this on scale because you get cultural niche, because you get solidarity around the entire region, rallying for these 1 or 2 athletes that are going to go very far into the Olympics, or that are going to go very far in other games outside of what happens in Southeast Asia. What is the weighing on this? 1 versus fairness. Versus fairness, what opening government tells you is, aha, guys, take the lowest hanging fruit here, right? They say, they bias their own athletes, and therefore there's less fairness in general, right? But on our side of the house, we prove to you that money is a prerequisite to fairness. And this happens in 2 ways. First, at the point in which you get significantly better quality of games, that's also the point to which more people watch the sport. And more people watch the sport, there's more scrutiny. You see whether or not their specific people are doping. You see whether or not specific countries are playing this fairly. And this is important because for the sport or for this program, in order to have any legitimacy and get more money from things like sponsors, etc., they need to present their committee as something that is incredibly fair in the first place. But second, at the point in which increasing quality of the games, because you just get to watch these sports at the highest level, you need to get significantly more money. Their response is, aha, guys, this is no different from the ASEAN games now, but you can have sports that are better than the ASEAN games now because of the fact that you're able to outcompete them on the quality of games when these athletes have more levels to train. Also means you're better able to uphold more standards of fairness when these communities get significantly more revenue, because upholding fairness is expensive. It takes inspections, it takes audits, it takes doping tests, which are all incredibly expensive because you have to get it to every single athlete out there, which just means in our side of the house, you're better able to materially uphold the standards of fairness in the first place. I'm then gonna outweigh what opposition bench says on culture in the first place. First, money is a prerequisite to upholding culture. Even if it were the case that on their side of the house, 1 or 2 countries are able to get their niche spot for 1 year, they never prove why this niche sport is going to get so much revenue that they're going to necessarily be able to keep upholding that niche sport, especially when I've POI'd op-bench many times that most countries run deficits from hosting sports, which means they need more sports to overcompensate the initial deficit that comes from hosting the event in the first place. And we get that better on our side of the house, and money's more likely to also be distributed to those areas because you need many countries competing in this specific event for it to necessarily be quite legitimized team in the first place. It's the Southeast Asian games, not the Malaysian games. You get better distribution on our side of the house, which also goes to those culturally niche sports. Even on every team's metrics, closing government still wins. Money is important, it's a prerequisite to upholding your sport. Very proud.
I think the call for further speech. Now I invite the op whip. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Okay, thank you, everybody. Three things to say. First of all, engagement to CG's slight extension. Secondly, let's talk about capacity to host like this game, which is very important for the many arguments premise. Lastly, let's talk about the niche sports, especially with engaged to the OG's investment argument. First of all, engagement CG. I don't know where is that very new point from closing government. Many points is overlapped with OG in the first place. Slightly, I catch a nuance like timeline problem is exclusively suggested by CG. But it's not the intrinsic problem of this system itself, right? Just earlier, they will suggest a schedule, they will list up many sports, then they can prepare, athletes can prepare, and the investment can be prepared. In that kind of cases, what CG said is very, very minor, very solvable point by the model. In that kind of situation, I don't know that CG's unique contribution to win this debate. Then let's move on to capacity to host like this game. This is important because economic benefit, good representation, fairness, those many arguments in the opening half are predicated upon the fact this game, this system holds healthily and successfully. There is good judge, there's good accommodations, that athletes can work, and there's good representation. People can get persuaded, convinced by the result because there is a good judge like you. In that kind of situation, we see there is fairness, we see sports is enjoyable, we have more incentive to try to watch sports, but have to sustainably engage in the sport activity or whatever. In that kind of situation, success of this game is very important. To do this, depending on the autonomy by having this description is extremely important. My partner already told you, without description, how that overcapacity to the host country exists. Three things to say, my partner already told you. It's politicization of discussion, the power imbalance among the nations like Singapore, but too much inclusion. Actually, this is happening in the same kind of model, like Olympic game. There's a discussion basis, the idea of the inclusion, there's a power imbalance. In that kind of situation, there are many like politicization, therefore like many like even though there's no capacity for the Japan or Rio de Janeiro to do that, still they will push many things to those countries. There are many health problems my partner already identified exist. Then the very lazy response from their side of the house, we were not comparative. We are very comparative. We say, especially when there is a description, the host country have a capacity to deal with the many problems and get economical benefit. Four things to say. First of all, with description, there are more autonomy to decide what kind of game they have to decide. You do what amount of game they will do that, what kind of method they can freely decide that. Secondly, they have justification to refuse other countries' hostage, other countries' demand or something like that, because other countries do same way. Like in some country they prioritize Muay Thai, in some country they will prioritize soccer, whatever. In that kind of senses, you did it. Then therefore, like we have the same stages, we have justification to do our sports. In that kind of senses, like it's less difficult to politicize those kind of things. Therefore, like more like flexible, like according to the capacity, the host country can hold games whatsoever. The third reason is host country can make full use of pre-existing structure. For example, if that country is famous for its Muay Thai, there are already stadium or the place where good judges, the accommodation, the culture of the Muay Thai. Therefore, they don't have to newly create a stadium or something like that. In that kind of senses, they can make full use of already existing pre-existing structure. Therefore, it is easier for the host country to calculate what kind of benefit will accrue, how many people will come or something like that. Therefore, more rational calculation with more certain benefit can be achieved. Fourthly, even if international visitors will not come, still, if that if host countries nation-wide accepted sports is held, the very certain benefit is very promised, right? If Muay Thai is very popular and many people will mobilize, in that kind of situation, surely you can get the benefit from that. In that kind of situation, without risking your economy by creating a new stadium which might not be able to be used in the future because of less popularity of another soccer or basketball, new sport, something like that. In that kind of situations, with description, each country has its capacity and make full use of the infrastructure and get certain benefits with healthy environment, right? As my partner already told you, if you know how much amount of accommodation is necessary, if you shrink the amount of member, you can decide to what extent of quality of food, quality of stadium or something like that can be guaranteed. In this point, people can like see that, oh, that sport is very fair. That sport sounds good. Athletes passionately take action. That sounds very good. Those kind of things happen. In that kind of situation, exclusively on our paradigm, athletes can energetically move and people will get moved by this kind of activity. Then that will benefit the trickle down. Okay, OGPOI, please.
Yeah, obviously there's going to be some trade-off of not including all popular sports because the host country won't have a strategic advantage within those sports. So obviously you're compromising on viewership and hence you're compromising on the funding you're getting out of these games.
So I cannot get what you mean by, but the host country also have rational ability to consider like balance, like some getting popularity, sports, and get the benefit in accordance with their own capacity. But this cannot be done, especially when discussion-based, vote-based politicization discussion exists. There are very huge power by the other country exists. There's no justification to refuse that. In that kind of situation, harm my partner accrue. Then lastly, let's talk about niche sports. OG argued, like after getting the economical benefit, they can use this money in order to nurture like niche sports. Then therefore it is very good. Two problems we see. First of all, it's dubious whether actually economical benefit happens because the exclusively CEO told you how this overcapacity problem will be very not beneficial for the host country. For example, in the Osaka Prefecture, for the Tokyo Olympic, they created a stadium. In order to create a stadium, they have to pay fee, like maintenance fee, they have to hire staff, many things done, but not so much many audience did not come. In that kind of situations, rather like but harm was override. In that kind of situation, the fact you host something that does not necessarily mean that will be successful, you get the profit. In that kind of situation, the benefit of the economy does not make sense, especially when we already told you the probability of the failing. Secondly, even if they get investment, they get money, it's not necessarily those people will use this money to the niche game. Right? Especially when there is an invasion of a popular game, right? Popular game like basketball, soccer, will be held with very mainly, majorly, there are many coverage. In that kind of situation, more children might see that, oh, becoming a soccer player is okay, becoming a basketball player is very good. So those kind of things happen. In that kind of situation, the player for the niche like field are more like cannot be attained. Therefore, like the industry of niche game will be shrink. This is more, 時間か. Sorry, thank you.
I thank you all for their speech. Yeah, this concludes the debate. I think DOC can finish the recording, I guess.